Good. I have extra now. Wow. Okay. You can take some home for the kids. All right. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much for being our readers for Torah, for Haftarah, for Esther, and all the other things that we chant. This program has been something that we've talked about at Ritual Committee for quite a few years off and on. We never really found a good time to do it. And we realized there was never going to be a perfect time. So we're doing it. But what I hope this will do is give you a few different insights into how to read more smoothly and more accurately. Because I'm sure that all of you, when you learned your trope, learned it very well. But there are ways to improve how it works by understanding what it's meant to do. And therefore, it can accomplish what it's meant to do more perfectly. You'll notice by the thing here, singing is a small part. I am not here to tell you how to sing. I'm not here to tell you how to chant in terms of musical notation. There will be no music played during this discussion. However, what we do talk about should easily integrate with any trope tradition that you may have and follow, and only make it better, and maybe even help you understand some of the weird things that the trope systems and melodies already do. So let's get to work. Why do we have trope? Trope is there to give us punctuation. Trope is there to give us pronunciation, and trope is there to beautify how we read from our sacred texts in that order. That is to say, trope itself is first job, and the reason it was created was in order to make sure that we had proper punctuation of our texts. As an aside, it also makes sure that we are pronouncing things correctly in the most perfect way possible, something that could be easily missed even by native speakers of Hebrew. And then, of course, it makes it more beautiful. When doing triage, this is the order in which you should be focusing on how you are chanting. Punctuation. Why is it important? Let's eat grandma. Let's eat grandma. Two very, very different sentences, right? That little comma, you can see it visually. You can't hear a comma unless you make a difference in your voice. Let's eat grandma. Let's eat grandma. One of those had a comma, one didn't. You can't hear it. I'm a human being. I'm not, Siri. I can actually say, let's eat grandma. And now all of you know that I'm not a cannibal. And if I were to say, let's eat grandma, you would wonder whether we were the Donner Party and drawing the short straw. Same thing, the panda eats, shoots, and leaves, or the panda eats, shoots, and leaves, right? It eats, shoots, and leaves. There's actually a very famous book about grammar with that title, which is a really fun read if you like reading about grammar. Similarly, without punctuation, which the Torah lacks, you would be left to freely interpret with your own punctuation. Trespassing forbidden, no swimming allowed? No. Trespassing forbidden? No. Swimming allowed. With the right intonation, you can make words say the opposite of what they were intended to say. And the trope is designed to prevent that from happening by grouping and separating. That is what trope's primary purpose is meant to do. Okay, so that's why there are two different types of tropes. There are conjunctive and disjunctive tropes. There are ones that link and ones that separate. If you look on your front page, you'll see that there are joiners and separators. The blank boxes join and the hash mark boxes separate, meaning that you breathe between the disjunctive tropes. Wherever the dark boxes are, after you finish that word, you can take a breath. And you don't breathe between the conjunctive tropes. Make sense? Okay, let's make it a little bit more complicated then. There are different levels of conjunctive, of linking up your tropes. There are emperor, king, duke, and earl trope, and then there are footman trope. And this should be, I believe, the second page. And that's how big your breath should be. The higher up on the chart, the more you should breathe, because that's where you're telling a person, this section is done. And so on and so forth down. So, for example, when you do a rivia or rivi'i, depending upon which name you learned, when you learn that particular trope, and why are you telling me that Gmail stopped? I don't care. Then after you finish that trope, you should not immediately run on to the next one. Similarly, if you have just had a lovely kadma to begin, don't take that as your opportunity to yawn. Don't take that as your opportunity to take another deep breath before you finish the rest of a long phrase. You need to find the right spots because you are changing the flow of the sentence if you breathe in the wrong place. And you're passing out if you don't breathe at all. Make sense? Now, you might also want to think about these as a certain hierarchy of focus. And this goes for those of you who are also Gebayim. If someone blows through an etnachta, that is to say, they are reading and you can't tell that they just hit an etnachta. They did not pause significantly after that etnachta. It's okay to just put your hand up for them just to slow them that extra second. Because an etnachta or a sof pasuk that is missed has now disrupted the flow of the narrative or the law that's being given in the Torah. The other ones are slightly less significant, but for correction purposes. But for practice purposes, you should be making sure that you're recognizing your major stops that give you the right flow of that sentence. And when you learn enough Hebrew, or if you already know enough Hebrew to compare the translation to the trope, you'll see the way it groups makes a really big difference of where you can think of things as being like colons and semicolons and commas as far as levels of pausing and level of disjoining the words. And you will find yourself really much more fluid in your chanting. Questions? Good? Good. Learn it. Thankfully, learning it isn't that hard because it's not really just a big set of random trope all in different categories, although these are the levels that you'll know. They actually come together as a family. And when you learn how to chant, what you're learning is not just mercha all by itself and tipcha all by itself, but you are learning mercha, tipcha, munach, etnachta as a unit, as a phrase, as a family. And if you look at a page that looks like this, you will see the most common family combinations. Anybody here who has a family that's larger than one will know that not all of the family goes together all the time. And sometimes somebody stays home. Yes, we all know that? Good. So the same is true for trope. Not all of the families members show up in every single occasion. Sometimes you will, very rarely, get just a etnachta and just a sof pasuk without preamble or anything else going along with them. It's not common, but it does happen. Sometimes you will get a tipcha before your etnachta. Sometimes you will get a mercha tipcha munach etnachta altogether. Sometimes you will get a mercha tipcha etnachta. One thing you will notice if you begin to recognize your family members by familiarity is they're not changing positions. Everyone has their seat in the car, which means they're going to come in a particular order when they come. They may not all be in the car, but you're always going to know who's first, who's second, who's third, who's fourth, and so on. Knowing that pattern means that you can anticipate what the next melody is going to be. And that makes it much easier to learn and to memorize the melodies. It also makes it much more natural to know where you're going to be breathing and where you're going to be resting or not resting for the remainder of that clause. How are we doing so far? Okay. I highly recommend that you use this page as a sort of practice guide with either the names or your favorite words substituted, or just la-line the melody of the trope that you know best. If you can run through this list and know where to breathe and where not to breathe in the usual combinations that show up, you will be set for handling 90% of what the chanting is ever going to throw at you. And having those in your pocket means you don't have to remember precisely, excuse me, which one's a king, which one's a duke, which one's an earl. You'll have integrated it by memorizing the family portrait.
This is for Torah reading?
Those are for all reading. For all reading. This, what I'm saying so far, is applicable to every form of trope, except sort of the Psalms, but that's really a very specialized case and not something we need to go into. But for every public reading that we are likely to do, whether it be Torah trope, regularly Torah trope for Yamim Noraim, for high holidays, Megillat Esther, Eicha, any trope that we're using for public reading follows these rules.
Haftarah as well.
Haftarah as well, exactly. Yeah, all public reading.
It's not the same melody, but
not the same
combination.
Exactly, because remember, that's the least important thing. And which is why when you go to different communities around the country or around the world, they can have wildly different melodies. But if they're chanting properly, they'll be breathing in the same places. And their Torah will still make the same sense, which is how we've remained one people, even though we've got lots of different musical traditions, because we're still using the same Torah. Our Torah still has the same commas, periods, colons, and all those other good things in it, even if we sing them a little differently in different places. Make sense? All right. So, and it's okay to be amazed and marvel at the wisdom of our sages who created the trope system in order that we would be able to do that. This was not given at Sinai in the terms of the little lines and dashes or the melodies, which is why a variety of melodies is perfectly acceptable. But the phrasing was given with Torah. And our sages had to figure out how to capture that phrasing in some form of notation that would allow it to be maintained no matter where the Torah traveled or any of our other texts traveled. And I think they did a pretty good job. It is the, from what I remember reading, the oldest continuously used musical notation system in the world. They found evidence of notation, or what they think is notation, that is older, but no one does it anymore. We're still doing this.
How far back does it go?
At least about 1400 years, which, you know, is actually getting to be pretty old for Judaism. We don't call that new. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about melodies, though. So before we get to some of the main pronunciation points and issues, let me remind you that melody system you use is less important than accurate punctuation and pronunciation of the verses. However, if someone was to use a pseudo-trope, sort of, I don't actually know the trope, but I'm just going to say things that are using melodies that are like the trope, that is less helpful than actually just reading the verse correctly, using the proper phrasing of what the trope was meant to indicate. So if someone got up there and they said, you know what, I cannot sing at all, right? Which is not true. Everybody can sing. They may not all be able to sing well enough to get their own recording contract, but as a cantor who was teaching us liturgy in rabbinic school pointed out to one of my classmates when he said he couldn't sing and this was a waste of time, the cantor pointed out that there was someone on his choir that was deaf. And he said, you are not more tone deaf than she is, because she can't hear tones of any variety, and she's learned to sing by practice and working on it. But let's imagine absolutely you cannot sing. You have some deep-seated psychological fear of melody. I don't know what it might be. If you still want to read Torah, you still need to match the correct phrasing. That is the point of the trope, and that is the point of Torah, is that we actually can feel it flow in the correct phrasing. So you don't have to always sing it, but you do have to structure it. Good. And that also goes, by the way, if you lose your way while reading, even if you are a master of trope and can sing beautifully, if your voice cuts out, make sure that you will resume reading in a way that fits with the flow of the verse. Don't just start putting in breaks randomly. Okay. So let's get to all the fun stuff. There are two main issues with Torah pronunciation, and this goes for Haftarah and other texts as well, but we'll be focusing mainly on Torah just because it's the most common reading that we do. There are regular sounds and altered sounds. Regular sounds are the usual sounds word make in the abstract. That is to say, if you were to pluck a word out of a dictionary, and it's not a part of a sentence, it's not part of a verse, it's not part of any conversation, it's just a word floating by itself. You caught it. Altered sounds are how the sounds actually are made when they are in context, and then they get modified by pronunciation, punctuation, and stress influences. So, for example, did you? Nobody here, except when speaking to a foreigner, ever says, did you, unless you're chewing someone out. Did you put out the trash? Right? We enunciate like that when we are bawling someone out. Instead, if you were going to ask this colloquially, you'd say, did you put out the trash? Did you? Did you? Right? This is the real word. This is how it's actually pronounced. Nowhere in English will you see it written did you, unless someone's writing some dialect in a particular novel. But if you were going to try and capture English, you would want to write it out phonetically, and you'd want to put the stresses in the right way so that people read it so it sounded like the real words. Guess what? Trope did that for us. The way the Torah was punctuated and the way the vowels are modified allows us to duplicate almost precisely what the original phrasing and feel of the words was, even if we don't understand it today. It's like someone created a Didya process. Moss and Moses. Moss, we have a nice sibilant S. Moses, all of a sudden it's going zzz. Why? Because English is crazy and doesn't tell you. In Hebrew, there are indicators that will tell you when that letter is changing how it sounds. And we're going to talk about what those indicators are and why they are important. Stress also changes the vowels enormously in English, and we never tell people this, right? Geo, geo, two long vowel sounds. Geo, wait, geography? Shouldn't it be geography? What happened to my long O from my geo? The accent moved and that O got shortened. English does this all the time. Geographer, right? Geographic, wait, over here it was geography, and now over here it's geographical. My A goes to an A or an A. Why? Because of where the accent falls in the word. And all of that is being governed by the prefixes and suffixes and system in English. And we never tell anyone this secret. Hebrew does. That's what Trope does for you, and all the punctuation and the vowels and everything on the page and all those little dots and dashes. They're telling you the secrets behind how to pronounce it correctly. In English, we just make you look like an idiot if you're a foreigner. Okay, so here's what we're going to use to try and unpack all of this. We're going to look at syllables. We're going to look at milah mileh. We're going to look at meteg, shvanan, shvanach. We're going to look at dagesh, kamatz katan, the vav conjunct, that should be vav consecutive, and the pausal forms, mapik and makef. If there are things on that list that you don't recognize, good. You are going to get more benefit out of tonight's discussion. Syllables. Hebrew syllables follow easier rules than English. Thank God. Literally. They always start with a consonant, except for the oo at the start of a word. And that's when oo comes as an and form at the start of a word. They all have a vowel. And that vowel can be a regular vowel. That vowel can be a half vowel. Or that vowel can be a resting shva. We're going to come back to the resting shva and the moving shva a little bit later. But that's that two dots right there. Open syllables and closed syllables make a big deal in Hebrew. Open syllables end in a vowel, usually long, and short syllables end in a consonant and usually have a short vowel. Stress will flip that status, usually. Thankfully, this all gets written out in the text that we work on, so you don't have to come up with it on your own thinking. But knowing that this is happening will help explain the oddities greatly. So, the large majority of Hebrew words are accented on the final syllable. Right? In English, geography, right? Geographer. We put accent wherever we feel like it. It's just haphazard. In Hebrew, the large majority on the final syllable. This is called milra, right? That's the technical term for a word who has its accent on the final syllable. The minority of words are accented on the next to last syllable, or penultimate, which I use only because I don't get enough opportunities to say penultimate. This is milel, right? Those are your two options, basically. Now, the great thing is, you don't have to know this by heart. The trope will be marked on the syllable that gets the accent. So even if you're not sure, look for the trope symbol, whichever syllable it's under or over, That's the syllable that gets the accent. Proper pronunciation requires the correct syllable gets the stress, like these two words in English. What are those two words in English?
Record and record.
How do you know it wasn't record and record?
You don't.
You don't like that, but you would in a sentence. You would know it by context, and because you're all native speakers. And thankfully, Hebrew does not demand so much of us. It's been spelled out for us so that we can know whether it's record or record, where the stress goes. And you notice the vowels change drastically by where that stress goes. The cantillation will always be under that accented syllable, except, there's always a few exceptions, but fewer in Hebrew than most languages, except for the two different talisha. That's the talisha ketana and the talisha gedola. Those are the horn magnifying glass, means horn, the horn, what's it, magnifying glass looking things. One that goes to the right, one that goes to the left, right? Sometimes those will not be on the accented syllable, because those, along with kadma, which you'll see up here, sorry, not kadma, should have said pashta, that's why you proofread. Those go in specific locations to the word. Pashta is always hanging off the leftmost edge, and the two talishas are off the right or leftmost edge, respectively. If you're not a native speaker and you're using just a regular chumash, you might be in trouble of knowing where the real accent is. However, if you are using a good tikkun, if you're using a book that has been designed in order to help somebody master how to read that section, there will be shadows, either a duplicate or one in a slightly different size or a slightly different shading of the other trope. If it's not, if there are two pashtas or two talishas over a word, the one that's in the weird spot is the one where you're chanting it. Makes sense, right? Because the first one, the one that's either on the far right or the far left, is there to tell you what it is. And then the one that's in the weird spot is telling you where to actually say it. Make sense?
Yeah.
Our ancestors, they're very logical. Would have been nice if they'd come up with a different system for that particular thing, but you know, as exceptions go, it's not a really hard one. MedTech. This is where they help us yet again. In the Siddur. In the Siddur. Everyone got that we're now talking about the Siddur? Just a little aside, but it's good to know for the group that's here. Where there is no trope in the Siddur, right? We're not reading the Ve'ahavta, but just reading the regular prayer. The vertical line, beep, called a meteg, will appear under the accented syllable if it isn't the final one in the word. Right? So that
meteg or the final syllable?
The syllable, right? So for example, the hakadosh, the dosh is the final syllable. I don't see any other indicator that the syllable, another syllable is stressed. So I know that dosh is my default final syllable. That's where the accent goes, because that's what I should be leaning towards. Bashamayim, that would be my instinct, if I didn't know Hebrew better, to go on the last syllable. But the meteg moves me back and says Bashamayim. And now I'm putting it in the right spot, right? It's a little different in the Torah or Haftarah, because in the trope, the meteg will appear under a secondary syllable. Remember, the primary stress syllable is going to get your actual trope, but the secondary stress is going to get a meteg. And that means when you hit it, you do need to have a minuscule hesitation. Right? We're not talking about one of the emperor breaks, right? It's not vehishta chavitem, it's vehishta chavitem. Just a slight extra fraction of a second more. And this is one of those things where if you miss it, it's not a catastrophe. And definitely not something that the Gabayim are going to correct you on. But it is good to know why it's hanging out there so that when you're reading and preparing, it doesn't confuse you. There is one other place where you will also find something that looks like a meteg, but technically it's not. A siluk, it's a sof pasuk. This line right here, when it comes before the colon at the end of a verse, that's not a meteg. That's actually the cantillation for the end of the verse. Official name is siluk, or it's often just colloquially called sof pasuk, the end of the verse, because we're not very creative when it comes to naming things in Judaism. All right. Now we get to the point where people's eyes roll back into the head. Shva. Remember how I said how brilliant and logical and wonderful our ancestors were for coming up with all of the symbols to help make our life easier? If they had come up with one more vowel, just one more vowel, our life would have been much, much easier. But, well, no, they've got one, the 2 dots. And then, oh, the kamatskatan? There's enough clues that help, and we're going to talk about things that can help even so you don't have to go through the logic game of figuring this out. But there are technically 2 completely different vowels that both look exactly like the 2 dots that go vertical. Right? They are totally different vowels because one of them is a vowel, half vowel technically, and the other one isn't a vowel at all. It's simply a marker to show the absence of a vowel. It's kind of like in those official forms where there's a big gray spot that says "do not write here," where someone wrote "do not write here" in ink, right? That's what those 2 dots are in some cases. It's saying there's no vowel here, keep moving. And they had to put something there to make sure you didn't mistakenly think that there was meant to be a vowel there. It's that way you know that it's an empty spot because it's been filled. Yes. So the shvana is an active vowel sound, but it is considered truncated, a half vowel, and it doesn't count as its own syllable. So if you were doing the old counting your syllable games, you technically would not clap for a shvana, one of these. In most pronunciation systems, however, it does sound like a very short little it, like in the word pit, right? So get. You wouldn't just say g, you'd be get, and then you'd move on. So it's almost like a syllable, but not quite. You're almost swallowing that vowel as you say it. Make sense? People are familiar with this from basic Hebrew pronunciation, I'm sure.
Is this what we see as an apostrophe in a transliteration?
Yes. In many, many transliteration systems, this will be represented by a little apostrophe. Absolutely right. Sometimes it'll just be the letter and a dash, but apostrophe has become kind of the most common way of representing it. If you look in some academic journals, they'll put little superscript E's next to the words in transliteration, and it really makes it hard to read. But that is the most common that you'll find in the Siddur, little apostrophe. And that means you need to say a little it after it, which of course the people reading transliteration haven't had explained to them. But that's a whole nother question. So you do hear it. It will come at the start of a syllable, and it will come in the middle of a word showing you that it is starting a syllable if it's following after a long vowel.
What's a long vowel?
Okay, what's a long vowel in Hebrew? Well, it is the long vowel sounds. The A, the O, the oo, the long vowel sounds that we have in English are long vowel sounds in Hebrew, except for a variety of O that we're going to get to that we're going to call kamatskatan, and it's going to make your life a little more complicated. But in general, those are the longer vowels. So this is the one that most people can usually spot when it's at the start of a word quite easily. Because if it's the first letter of a word, it's got to be the start of a syllable. Because remember, all the Hebrew words, or all Hebrew syllables begin with a consonant and vowel comes second, or half vowel as the case may be. Shvanach is its silent twin brother that marks that no vowel is there for that consonant. So you'll often find words that have, you know, a letter in the middle of them with 2 dots under it, and there's nothing else to say except right? Just to finish off the syllable with a consonant sound, if it was a resh, for example. If you ever see 2 of them coming back to back under 2 letters that are connected to each other, the first one will be the rest, and the second one will be the active. Because the first one is clearly finishing a syllable, which means it's time to begin a new syllable. How are we doing? Okay.
Can you just give examples of words that fit into this?
The shvanach? Hold on a second. Let me back up here. I think we should have vehish. Right? That shin, that's a shvanach.
Okay.
Right? So you hear how you don't hear anything.
Right.
Whereas
Right.
the hakadosh, the vi is clearly a shvanach. What's that?
You have the and
Yeah,
ish
yeah,
in that same word.
Yeah. Yes, in the Vehish, yeah, the first one is a na, the second one is a nach. The first one is active, second one is not.
And the shvana is a separator. It means don't attach this to the following letter.
As a syllable, exactly. Exactly, it's a syllable separator. The usual syllable separator, the usual way to indicate that a syllable is being ended is with a vowel. But sometimes the vowel is followed by a consonant without a vowel of its own. And that's when the shvanach gets to do its job. Right? Because that's why, cha, right here in the middle, and ta, those are unique syllables all to themselves. Well, actually, cha is only half a syllable because it's, but we don't need to go down that hole. But
So in our new Siddur,
yes, thank you.
they look different.
In our new Siddur, thank you, Rabbinic Assembly, they actually printed the shvana and the shvanach differently. The shvanach, if you look at the Hebrew carefully, is the regular size of all the other vowels. The shvana, the one you're going to hear, is slightly bigger, like 15-20% bigger. So it looks like almost like it's been bolded. Sometimes it's really easy to miss if you're not looking for it. In tikkunim, that is to say, in the books that help learn and prepare, many of the newest tikkunim will often have an indicator for these as well. Many of them will put a line that is out of nowhere above the letters that are using a shvana, the one that you'll hear, in order to tell you that it's happening. So if you're still using the lovely old photocopied blue tikkun, that when you look at the letters, it's like, was this like being shaken when they were making the print? You might want to consider upgrading. There are some, I know they may have emotional connections, and that's good, but there are tools out there that have better indicators that will make your life easier. So you don't have to remember all of the stuff that we're talking tonight. You'll still be able to do it just by what's on the page, because we have had new sages that have updated trying to indicate these things. And we're going to get to that as well when we get to Kamatz Katan. Where are we? Dagesh, everybody's favorite thing. The dagesh is the dot found in the middle of a consonant. It hardens, there should be an S there, or doubles the sound of the letter. We're not going to go into all the grammatical rules of whether it's a hardening or a doubling for tonight. It appears and hardens the sound of the beged kefet letters if it starts the syllable and there is no vowel in front of it. Right? So again, this is a little complicated if you're trying to put the vowels into a blank piece of text, but if you are reading from a tikkun, this is not a problem. If there's a dot in one of these letters, then you know that you'll need to pronounce 3 of them in the modern pronunciation scheme differently. Right? You'll be pronouncing your vet as a bet, you'll be pronouncing your chaf as a kaf, and you'll be pronouncing your fe as a pei if there's a dot in the middle of it. If you come from the Ashkenazic school, then your taf will also change, but that's not the most common pronunciation. Apologies. So in antiquity, the other letters also had alternative pronunciation styles, but those have fallen out of use over the last few thousand years. Apologies to our ancestors, but language does that. It's remarkable how much has remained static. You might also be interested to know that the change that happens for all of these letters with and without the dagesh is exactly the same from a linguistic point of view. What you do is you make the same letter in the exact same part of your mouth or throat with the same apparatus, tongue, teeth, or whatever else is happening. And the only thing that happens is whether you let the air flow or whether you stop it and then let it go. If you let it flow, then there's no dagesh in it. Right? I'm using my lips, the front of my mouth, and I'm using my vocal cords to make the y sound, or that may be someone's phone. But if there is a dagesh, the air gets to the same spot, stops, and then pops. It bursts, if you will. And when I'm still making the vocal cord sounds, and everything else is the same. And the same thing with I should be making those 2 sounds in the same place of my throat. And the same thing with a same place, same apparatus. Okay. It can also appear, if it's not a beged kefet letter, it can appear in trying to keep reining it in. It can appear in almost every other letter. And if it doesn't appear in letters because it won't allow it, you get compensation with the vowels. That's where you get those weird double vowel looking things underneath letters. That's because it's picking up for the slack because it couldn't put a dot where it wanted. It'll appear in any other letter except those weird ones because of conjugation rules or because it's compensating for another missing letter in a contraction. Again, you don't need to be able to point and put the points into a blank piece of text, but it's helpful to know why it's appearing because it'll help you also know where syllables break. Okay, so you can do just a few examples. That's blurrier than it looked on my computer at home. So yik bor, you can see that we've got our dagesh coming here because it is beginning a syllable after the kuf. That's why it's got a lovely little dot in the middle, whereas kavar is not beginning a syllable because it's not coming after a long vowel to have a syllable all on its own. You won't need to know that on your own. You'll be able to get that just because it's already been printed in the book for you. Make sense? Anyone have any question if you're looking through these very quickly? You can see this is a really weird academic form of transliteration. Gesenius' book on grammar, Hebrew grammar, it's considered sort of the touchstone, written in the 1800s, but it's still the one that's mainly used because he sort of laid it out, and that's what this is taken from. Good, onward. Kamatz-katan. No vowel is more mispronounced or misunderstood or maligned than poor kamatz-katan. This little T-shaped vowel has two sounds. I know your religious school teachers may have only told you one, and they may have told you that there's an exception, but don't worry about it. You'll just learn the few words that it matters for. And that works for the Siddur, because for the Siddur, it doesn't come up all that often, and usually comes up in the word kol, for example. But apart from that, you're only going to bump into it occasionally. In the Ve'ahavta, for example. But for the most part, you can get by without it and not have a problem. When you are a solo reader, chanting Torah, chanting Haftarah, chanting anything else, missing the kamatz-katan is fingernails on a chalkboard. It is just very disturbing because it can change the meaning of the word. In a open or closed but accented syllable, it sounds like our familiar ah, the one that you probably learned when you learned what this vowel actually sounds like. In a closed and unaccented syllable, it has a short O sound. I know I told you a little while ago that O was a long sound, but Hebrew actually has two O sounds. It has a long O and a short O. And the modern ear normally won't hear the difference, but you should definitely not linger on that syllable if it's one of these and you're making an O sound. So this is not the place to say Hochma, because it's Hochma. If it was Hochma, then we wouldn't be saying ho, we'd be saying ha, because that would be an accented syllable. Everyone following there's this just grammar humor for my own sake. So in these words, Hochma, Kol, Hofshi, Hodsho, that's a lot of chuz. That wasn't intended. All of these first kamatzes are actually kamatz-katan. They are in closed, unaccented syllables, and so they become an O sound. Now, you may be wondering, how am I going to know which are which? Well, some of them you'll learn, like chodsho or chodesh, and other types of expressions like that that are going to be fairly regular in many readings. Chorban, thank you. Another very common one with Leviticus around the corner. Chorban and korban are words that will come up a lot that have these in it. And I don't want to hear any karbans out there, right? It's korban for a sacrifice, not a karban. So, what's that?
It becomes carbon after.
There you go. It's burn. If you are not feeling comfortable, you can check with me. I have a number of readers that will check with me occasionally and say, verse such and such, fourth word, is this a kamatz-katan or is this not a kamatz-katan? And that's perfectly fine. I love getting grammar emails and texts, and I'm more than happy to help with those. On the other hand, if you get a modern tikkun, one that's been printed in around the last 10 or 15 years, these will often be set apart. They'll either be written bigger, the particular shape of the vowel will look a little different, or some other indicator in the tikkun will help you know This one is meant to be pronounced like O. And then you won't have a problem. When we also have it come paired with the shva, which again is a compensation thing, it will always be pronounced as an O as well. So that one, they don't indicate for you because it's automatic. So it is pa-o-lo, right? Not pa-a-lo. Make sense? Except in most modern forms of Hebrew, not universal, but many, if you have a kamatz before its double version, it will also turn into an O. So you will hear, for example, most people are going to read that word in modern Hebrew as sohorayim, not sahorayim. That's not to say that it's wrong if you do sahorayim, because there are some communities that do use that pronunciation tradition, but it has become more common to say mohorat rather than mahorat.
Mohorat.
Mohorat, not mohorat, but mohorat.
But the first two syllables rhyme in all those words.
The first two syllables in the bottom line rhyme.
What's a closed syllable?
A closed syllable is a syllable that ends with a consonant and the shva nach, sorry, the resting shva. We have an example here. Chof is the closed syllable, right, with the f being our finish. Chod is a closed syllable. These other ones at the bottom, none of those are closed syllables on the bottom line, which is actually why we have to have hoch with the closed syllable there that's finishing itself off, be a closed unaccented syllable.
Oh, because it's just the end of the word.
So kol, it's not because it's the end of a word. And in fact, if kol is by itself, it will be pointed differently. It will be pointed with a little dot hanging up over the top of it. But we will see kol like this by itself, sorry, not by itself, but with a little line connecting it to the next word, which we will cover, I believe, last in my list.
I'm sorry, tell me again on the bottom line, how do you know that the first syllable is closed?
Because the second one is.
That's the second. Pa-o-lo.
Yeah, pa'olo. Yeah, all three of these to the English ear, or actually even most modern Israelis, will have the same O sound. We're not lengthening and shortening our O vowel very much anymore. But that's just, you know.
The yod with the
Bo'oniya, right. For Jonah, he was not on a aniya, he was on an oniya. He was on a boat. Yeah, something else that during Mincha of Yom Kippur, when strength has ebbed, can be very flinching every time he gets on the wrong object.
Talking about Jonah, what happens? You just brought it up by mentioning that particular word. There's two tropes on that particular word.
Mhm.
How does that happen and why?
You mean two tropes that are cooperating, or do you mean like?
Yeah.
Right. I don't remember that off the top of my head, but sometimes you will get. Right. Sometimes you will get. Let's go back to that nice long word. Sometimes you will get a longer word like this, where rather than having a secondary stress marker from the meteg, you'll get another trope symbol all by itself. Usually it's a munach and sakif katon, the little L shape with the two dots above it. That's the most common combo that you'll find. And what you'll do is you will sing the first trope under the syllable that it's marking, and then you will continue as though it were a separate word, but without breathing in between, until you get to the next trope, and then sing its melody under that syllable. So that's the general rule. Okay, we were on Kamatz Katan. Vav consecutive. How we doing? Information overload? Now you know why I'm recording it. Anybody who would like a copy of the PDF of all the slides, I'm happy to send that to you electronically as well. Okay, the Vav consecutive. In biblical Hebrew, the Vav at the start of a word usually just means and. And it's a great party trick, by the way, that I was taught by my Mishnah teacher. If you go to the right parties, you ask someone to take out a chumash, and you say, all right, Pick a number between 1 and 5. And then you go to that book in the Torah and you say, all right, so pick a number between 1 and 30, 1 and 40, 1 and 50, depending upon the number of chapters. Pick a number between 1 and the end of the chapter. I make you bet the first letter in that verse is a Vav. And you can sound brilliant because like 85% of all verses in the Torah begin with a Vav. It's a stylistic thing. It's part of a biblical style, a biblical literary style. But it doesn't always mean and. Well, it can mean and other things as well, but and is almost secondary at this point. It can often change, and this is where my Tanakh teacher is going to have to tune out for a few moments, the future tense into a past tense. It can also change past into future. It's technically not changing either of them because there is no past and future in technical Hebrew grammar. There's perfect and imperfect, but we're not going to go down that rabbit hole either because we've already got enough that we're worried about. What matters, however, is rather than meaning something that will happen, that we would normally expect to get from a future tense verb, like these two at the bottom, it will instead mean that it did happen, which is really confusing to us because we think of them as being past and future, but that is biblical style. For us, the thing that's important and that you will not see marked in most of the tikkunim, that's saying not really, but it's good enough for today. That's so that my Tanakh teacher doesn't come back and haunt me. Is that when you are modifying these verbs like this, it will pull the accent towards the start of the word. Interestingly enough, in the inverse, when you are modifying a past verb to be a future tense verb, it actually pushes the accent to the end of the word wherever possible. But here, it's going to take what would normally be in the word yeshev, it would going to stretch that syllable, that accent back to the ye, vayeshev, rather than vayeshev. Normally, not such a big deal, but close on accented syllables make a difference because of kamatz katan. So this word here at the end, which my footnote has overwritten, anyone want to take a stab at how to pronounce that?
I can't see it.
Okay, we got two kamatzes underneath it, right? So it's vaya. You might read it as being vayamat, and I've heard it read that way many times, but it's vayamot, right? It becomes, the accent moves to the ya rather than the what would have been a ma and becomes vayamot. Right, so every time it's and they will die, or they died, it has to be vayamot. Otherwise, it just sounds really wrong.
Why is it an O sound?
It's an O sound because now the stress has moved here. The mem and the taf with the kamatz form a closed, unaccented syllable. So it goes back to our kamatz katan rule. A closed, unaccented syllable gets the O. So
There are a lot of vayamos.
yeah, a lot of people die. And a lot of people are punished with death if they do certain things. But that one comes up quite a bit. But it is important for stress, for the right syllable, although usually, again, you'll be guided by the trope marker that things like vayeshev also get the accent on the ye rather than the shed. How we doing? All right.
This is only in Torah Hebrew, not in colloquial?
Correct. Yeah, I think everybody around the table who's ever spent any time in modern conversational Hebrew, or even rabbinic Hebrew for the Mishnah, or for rabbinic texts in the Middle Ages, nobody is doing the vav consecutive. Right? That is like Shakespearean iambic pentameter.
Or any of these other nuances?
So I have heard from Hebrew instructors and grammarians that I've worked with that modern Israelis do not speak with a careful palette of sounds and structure. But that's coming from people who are very strict grammarians. And if you talk to an American grammarian or a pronunciation specialist, I had a linguist professor in university that also thought that we were butchering the language and just abusing the poor words to no end. So yeah, you don't find a lot of the things we've been talking about in colloquial Hebrew. Certain words have the kamatz katan burnt into people's mind that this is supposed to be a kamatz katan, but a lot wouldn't notice it because of a subtle change of accent or stress in the word. They might not even be doing that subtle change in the first place. which is going to bring us to, thank you for the segue, pausal forms. First thing off the bat, if you get this wrong, the Gebayim are not meant to correct you on this. But because of the way stresses move the accent, as it says, when a hard accent falls on a short vowel, it will tend to lengthen the vowel. And this is called the pausal form. And it is best to get it right rather than wrong, even if the Gebayim are not going to throw you off the bima for getting it wrong. Because it's simply the most beautiful form and correct form of Hebrew, which shows that you're actually paying attention to how the phrasing works. Because the whole phrase, going all the way back to our emperors and all of that, depending upon where the pauses happen, will often affect how the vowels respond underneath them. So, for example, the regular form, ani. Most of us know that regular form. Ani is also the same word, has the exact same meaning, but because it's got that etnachta, it's got that heavy pause, it becomes ani. Now, the stress you can probably hear. The lengthening of the vowel, we don't notice so much. Other places, we will. For example, eretz, earth, land. We're probably familiar with that. And sometimes when the accent goes onto that first syllable, it's going to be aretz. I'm sure that you've all heard that phrase in your chanting. You maybe wondered, why is it sometimes eretz? Why is it sometimes aretz? Look at the trope. If it is an etnachta or the sof pasuk, that's what's going to change it. And again, it's all printed for you, but it's still good to know why it's happening. One thing that comes up a few times in the Sidur, as well as in the Torah reading, is atah. We will oftentimes find that if the word atah is the final word of a sentence, it becomes a pausal form, which is atah, rather than atah. How are we doing? Good? The most famous one for that particular one is at the end of the Kedusha. Ki el melech gadol v'kadosh ata. The other place the ata comes up is in, is it the second or third paragraph of the blessing after the Haftarah, where again it's an ata rather than ata, because it's the same reason. It's coming at the very end of the sentence before the Baruch Atah that finishes off that particular paragraph.
Also noticed in the Torah thing, the Ein Eloheinu,
Yes.
always learned as atah. In here, we're doing atah.
Again, careful. Sometimes when we get into the Sidur land, melody can push things around and it gets a little bit wiggly. We like to try and keep the melody as close to the accent as possible, and we've sort of been working on that for the last few years in a few different places, like the second paragraph of Aleinu. But you'll still see holdovers because melody leads us in certain directions, especially melodies that are not based on Hebrew melodies, because there's no such thing as Hebrew melodies except trope. Every Hebrew melody that we now sing for any song, whether it be Aleinu or Shema or anything else, did not come from Sinai and did not even come from more than 1,000 years ago. So the only melodies we have that at least have roots more than 1,000 years old are the cantillation melodies.
I don't even understand the definitions here. I mean, so like number 5, why is you got Hedel and Havel?
Because the kamatz is the shortened version of the sigol.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to us.
And what's a hard accent? What does hard accent mean?
The hard accent is because of the pause, right? You're actually really stressing that syllable because you are stopping there. It's not just that it's the accented syllable. It's the accent and stop accent, because that is the middle of the verse thematically, which is the etnachta, or the end of the verse, the sof pasuk.
Okay. And just by the way, I always thought Eretz is in your land and Aretz is Israel. Is that not even true?
It's not technically true. It's what also happens is that they often will come as a pair, and so people get used to pronouncing it a certain way. But it's not because if you have Eretz Israel, you're always going to have a word after it that's connected to the word in front of it, which means the verse ain't done yet. So you're not going to stop on that word. But if you're talking about just the land, then you're speaking generically, and that's a really nice place to finish part of a sentence. You know, kol haaretz, the whole land. And now I'm done with that part of the sentence. Make sense? So it's not a rule that you can't be talking about Israel and say Aretz. It's just since we usually say Eretz Israel, it's very rare to ever just talk about Israel without that term Israel, then it rarely shows up in that way. But if, for example, you're reading sections about King David and he's talking about there's peace in the land, if it's not going to mention peace in the land of Israel, then you are going to end up with an Aretz in those circumstances. And that's clearly referring to the land of Israel, not to other lands.
But if you're talking about Mitzrayim, would it ever be called Aretz?
Yeah, I mean, like, there was blood in all the vessels, throughout the land, kol haaretz. But if you were talking about, Eretz Mitzrayim, then it would be an Eretz. Okay. Mapik, small point, but important. That was a joke. Small point, but important. Occasionally you will see a dot in a hey. If we had gone down the rabbit hole of which letters can take the dagesh or not, I would have pointed out a hey is one of the ones that doesn't get the dagesh, the dot. But occasionally we will see a dot, and that means it's not a dagesh. It's what we call a mapik. It looks the same. You hit the same key on your typewriter, but it's not. It's called a mapik, and this gives the letter its full consonant status. Right? Normally, a hey at the end of a verb or end of a word is just, you don't hear it at all, right? Lama. I don't hear anything. But when you throw a mapik into it, a dot into it, all of a sudden you're hearing it aspirated. You need to have a little bit of a for that to make sense. Why? Because sus is a male horse, susa is a female horse, and susa is her male horse. It's the pronominal possessive suffix. Yeah. And this is why the average Israeli doesn't conjugate like this. Because it's crazy to use in regular speech. I mean, very rarely, unless it's like set items, do people use it. They don't just put together random sentence structures like this willy-nilly. One thing that is very important, if it has a vowel, the vowel is heard first, right? So, for example, from Psalm 114, which is the second section of Hallel, that's that paragraph, the very end, or almost at the very end, Eloah Yaakov.
What does that mean?
What? The God of Jacob. Eloah is another of God's names. And it would be nice if we actually pronounced his name correctly. So
just not a female possessive like in
that is not a female possessive, exactly. You're learning. You're learning. You can pick up Gesenius on Amazon quite cheaply. Lots of students get rid of theirs after they finish the class. So, but I mean, the rules of the grammar are consistent within their exceptions. So it is not impossible to pick this up really just as a logic puzzle, even if it's not as a full operative language.
So is this the same idea as with the chet with the?
Yes, it sounds the same, but with a
ayin with the on?
Right, but ayin, because it doesn't have a consonantal sound, we don't hear that it's happening at the end of a word. It's just an by itself. Whereas this, there should be just a slight aspiration at the end of Eloah.
And if there were no mapik, there'll be Eloha.
Exactly right. If there was no mapik, it would be impossible for there to be a underneath that hey, right? It'd just be Elo, and we'd be done.
Hello.
Hello. It's a Cockney accent. One thing I should point out, as long as we're talking about final letters that have dots in them, one thing that can happen and is important to get right is our good friend dagesh, as I mentioned, can appear in a chaf and turn it into a kaf. At the end of a word, we often have many letters or many words that finish with a chaf sofit, because that is one of the pronominal suffixes. That's one of the ways you say you or yours at the end of a word. Occasionally, for varieties of good grammar reasons, there will be a dagesh in that word, sitting right next to the vowel. And if it's there, it should be pronounced like a kaf. So We say in the priestly benediction, vichuneka. Even though it's a kaf at the end of a word, which we're so used to in like Baruch, those final chafs at the end of the words, we're so used to just letting them roll. When you see a dagesh, turn it back into the hard sound, right? Vichuneka. Good? Good. Doesn't come up a lot, but it does definitely happen. Okay. Last page, I promise. Makef. So makef is not the Hebrew hyphen. The makef is this little dash that you'll see sitting between two different words. What the makef is doing is saying these two words are so closely connected within this phrase that you should just treat them as one unit. And that means, in terms of trope, that all of the earlier words lose their stress. They have no more stress. It's great. They went and had a spa day, no more stress. They push it all down the road to the last guy in the line. And that means that, as a byproduct, earlier words that are closed and now unaccented will have their vowels shortened. This is why we get kol in that form with the kamatz katan rather than with the dot, because it's usually with a makef, a little dash between it and the next word, and that means it got shortened and it shortens its vowel accordingly. Make sense? Okay, you can see an example of this. I took these actually from this week's Torah portion. You may have always wondered, why is it sometimes et with the sigil, with the 3 dots, and why is it sometimes et or 8, depending upon your pronunciation tradition, with the 2 dots, the sere? It's because this one has a makef and that one does not. This is the default form. This is the shortened form. Mind blown. Okay. And of course, only the last word then, because only one of them gets an accent, will have the cantillation marker. And anyone want to try and read that last word with our discussion of mapik? Right. Achota. Right. Just with a little. Right. Again, this might even get blended and blurred when you're reading, and that's not a catastrophe. But the more you practice it, the more confident you'll be in what you're doing. And also, it's nice to know why you're doing what you're doing. Ta, not ta, but ta. Yes. Just like in the third paragraph, or the third blessing of the Haftarah after blessing, right? Bivaneha, right? You're gladdening Zion with her children, not bivanecha, not with your children, speaking to somebody we haven't been talking to throughout that entire blessing. Good? Good. I'm sure you still have questions. That's good, because if you're now re-examining your Torah reading and trying to refine it and help move it to a more precise and good level, then you are doing what you should be doing. Torah should be read with a sense of awe and reverence. Sure, Torah should be read with a sense that getting it right matters. That good enough is where we finish up. It's not where we start. And that we should be striving to make it as correct as possible. And if we get up there and we make a mistake, that's why our Gabayim are there to help us and support us and make sure that we do get it right, even if it's good enough. But we shouldn't settle for good enough when we're beginning and when we're preparing. And just trying to integrate a few of these things into your thinking, or at least being able to notice them as you go through, will make a big difference. And if you have questions, I am a phone call, text, email, carrier pigeon away.
Show that first slide again.
You mean the one of the different structures with the breaks and everything?
No.
That one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Message achieved? Okay.
Punctuation. Don't forget your commas and.
Exactly. And for those of you who are completists, let me just explain what else you've got here in your handy-dandy trope packet. You have a list of the trope with a little more detail of what the meaning of the word is and which language it happens to have come from. It's just kind of cool to know why the trope is called what the trope is called. And then you will have one of my favorite diagrams. So this diagram and this page are doing the same job. They're telling you which trope can go with which pattern. but they're also telling you how that will work in a larger sentence structure. So it's trying to connect you to show you which trope are cooperating with each other, which ones are likely to come after each other in a broader sense. So it's interesting, but if you're not interested in memorizing a very, very complicated chart, which was really there more for shock value than help,
I did it.
I'm honest. What you can, however, notice is simply the patterns that your own mouth is making on a regular basis. That there are certain trope that are going to come after other trope, not just even within the families, but even outside of the families. There are certain combinations that become regular. And the more you do it, the more regular it becomes, and the easier it becomes to then do it more regularly. It really is almost a physical skill as much as a mental skill of having the muscle memory within your mouth and vocal apparatus of, after I've done these type of notes, I should expect from a short list, this, or this to come next. And that makes the memory easier, and it makes the production of the sound much easier as well. And make sure you just breathe in the right spots. That you may have to adjust. So you might want to, maybe you already have muscle memory of breathing in some awkward places, you may need to tweak that, but the rest of it only gets better with practice. Good. Thank you all very much for coming and your continued reading.